The evening sky had turned a deep purple as the Superior Court judge gathered his belongings from his chambers. It had been a long day of hearings, the kind that reminded him why he'd chosen this path 15 years ago. His black BMW, though not flashy, was a symbol of his hard work, from his days as a public defender to his current position on the bench. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few cars belonging to the cleaning staff and security guards. He adjusted his tie, checked his watch, 8:45 p.m., and pulled out onto the main street. The street lights were just starting to flicker on, casting long shadows across the road. As he drove, his mind wandered to the cases he'd heard that day. A young man facing drug charges who reminded him of kids from his old neighborhood. A custody battle that broke his heart. A small claims dispute that ended in an unexpected reconciliation. Each case was more than just a file number. It was someone's life story, their hopes, their fears, their future. The radio played softly in the background, a gentle jazz tune that helped ease the tension from his shoulders. He was looking forward to getting home, maybe catching the end of the basketball game, and definitely enjoying the leftover pot roast his wife had promised to save for him. The familiar route home took him through different neighborhoods, from the polished downtown district with its gleaming office buildings to the more modest residential areas where he'd grown up. No matter how far he'd come in life, these streets kept him grounded. They reminded him of his father's words, "Never forget where you came from, and never look down on where others are going." His thoughts drifted to tomorrow's docket. He had a full morning of arraignments ahead, followed by a sentencing hearing that had been weighing heavily on his mind. As a judge, he carried the responsibility of making decisions that would impact people's lives for years to come. It wasn't something he took lightly. The BMW's engine hummed smoothly as he turned onto the boulevard that would take him home. The street was quieter now, with just a few other cars sharing the road. In his rearview mirror, he noticed the flash of red and blue lights. At first, he assumed the patrol car was heading to an emergency, but then he realized the lights were meant for him. His heart sank a little, not from fear, but from a weary familiarity with what might come next. Despite his position, despite his professional attire, despite the late hour clearly suggesting he was heading home from work, he knew what this could mean. He'd been here before, many times, long before the word "Your Honor" preceded his name. With practiced calm, he signaled and pulled over to the curb, positioning his car exactly as the driver's manual suggested. He turned down the radio completely, turned on the interior light, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. These weren't just routine traffic stop procedures to him. They were survival skills passed down through generations. As he waited for the officer to approach, he glanced at his judicial ID card sitting in his wallet on the passenger seat. Years of education, decades of legal experience, and a position of respect in the justice system. Yet here he was, feeling that familiar knot in his stomach. But tonight would be different. Tonight would become more than just another story to tell at family gatherings. Tonight would change lives in ways neither he nor the approaching officer could yet imagine. The tap of footsteps grew louder behind him, and he took a deep breath, reminding himself of what his grandmother always said. Sometimes the best teaching happens when you're being tested the most. The beam of the officer's flashlight swept through the car's interior, harsh and bright against the evening darkness. The judge kept his hands steady on the steering wheel, even as the light lingered on his face a bit longer than necessary. Through his side mirror, he could see the officer's hand resting near his holster, a small detail that spoke volumes. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp enough to cut through the night air. There was no "good evening" or explanation for the stop. The judge noticed how the officer stood slightly behind the driver's side window, tense and suspicious, as if expecting trouble from a man who was simply trying to get home. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my wallet now. It's on the passenger seat with my registration." The judge spoke clearly and calmly, each word measured and deliberate. He taught his own children to do the same during traffic stops, to narrate their movements, to keep their voices steady, to swallow their pride if they had to. The officer's response was a curt nod, the flashlight beam never wavering. As the judge reached across the seat, he could feel the weight of scrutiny on his every movement. His fingers found his wallet, and with it, both his driver's license and the judicial identification that he knew would change the entire dynamic of this encounter. "Sir, I pulled you over because your right brake light is out." The officer's words came after the fact, almost as an afterthought. The judge knew his brake lights were working perfectly. He had them checked just last week during routine maintenance. But he also knew this moment wasn't really about brake lights. As he handed over his documents, the judge watched the officer's face in his side mirror. He saw the exact moment the realization hit, when the officer's eyes landed on the judicial ID card, and his expression shifted from stern authority to something between surprise and discomfort. The flashlight beam dipped slightly. "You're a judge?" The officer's voice had lost its edge, replaced by uncertainty. The hand near the holster dropped to his side. Now it was the officer who seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Yes, I am," the judge replied, his voice remaining as calm as it had been in his courtroom earlier that day. "I'm heading home from the courthouse." He could have added more. Could have pointed out the tailored suit he wore, or mentioned the complex cases he presided over that day. But he didn't. Sometimes silence spoke louder than words. The officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, paperwork in hand, clearly struggling with what to do next. The judge had seen this transformation before, not just in traffic stops, but in his courtroom too. That moment when someone realizes their assumptions have led them down the wrong path. "I apologize, Your Honor." "I didn't." The officer trailed off, probably realizing there was no good way to finish that sentence. What could he say? That he didn't expect a black man in a nice car to be a judge? That he didn't think someone he'd approached with such suspicion would turn out to be a pillar of the justice system? The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft hum of passing cars and the distant sound of a siren somewhere in the city. It was a moment of choice, one that would define not just this encounter, but potentially many lives going forward. The judge took a deep breath. He could handle this one of two ways. He could let his position do the talking and watch the officer squirm, or he could turn this into something meaningful. He thought about all the people who didn't have a judicial ID to change the tone of their traffic stops, about the conversations he'd had with his own children about driving while black, about the responsibility that came with wearing both his skin and his robes. Looking directly at the officer, he made his decision. This wasn't going to be just another story about power dynamics reversed. It was going to be something far more important. The officer stood frozen, still holding the judge's credentials in hands that had suddenly lost their authoritative steadiness. The nights seemed to grow quieter, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Even the distant traffic sounds felt muted, leaving just the soft tick of the car's cooling engine to fill the silence. "I've been in your shoes," the judge said softly, breaking the tension. "Back when I was a prosecutor, I worked closely with law enforcement. I know the pressures of the job." He watched as relief flickered across the officer's face, not just from learning about his background in law enforcement, but from the unexpected gentleness in his tone. The officer cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Your Honor, I should explain about the brake light." His voice trailed off as the judge raised a hand, not in anger, but in a gesture that had calmed many heated moments in his courtroom. "Why don't you walk with me and check that brake light?" the judge suggested, reaching for his door handle. "I had them checked last week, but maybe something's changed." He knew, and suspected the officer knew too, that this wasn't really about brake lights anymore. As they walked to the rear of the car, the judge pressed his brake pedal with his hand. The red glow of both brake lights painted the street in a crimson sheen. The officer's face flushed in the red light, not from anger, but from the unmistakable evidence of his mistaken pretense. Sometimes what we think we see isn't the full picture, the judge said, straightening up. He wasn't just talking about brake lights, and they both knew it. In my courtroom, I've learned that most situations are more complex than they first appear. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his badge catching the streetlight. Your Honor, I apologize. This stop was. He struggled to find the right words, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine regret. This stop was a teachable moment, the judge finished for him. For both of us. He noticed how the officer's hand, which had been so quick to rest near his holster earlier, now hung loosely at his side. The power dynamic had shifted, but the judge wasn't interested in wielding power. He was interested in creating understanding. Looking around the quiet street, the judge thought about all the similar stops happening across the city right now. About all the drivers who didn't have the protection of a title before their name. About all the officers trying to do their job while carrying the weight of unconscious biases they might not even recognize. Let me tell you about a case I heard last week, the judge began, leaning slightly against his car. A young officer made a split-second decision that changed someone's life. Not through violence or abuse, but through assumption and misunderstanding. He watched as the officer's posture changed, becoming less defensive and more attentive. The streetlight above them flickered, casting shifting shadows on the pavement. In that unstable light, they were just two men having an honest conversation about difficult truths. The judge's robe and the officer's badge, though not physically present, hung invisible between them, symbols of a system they both served but saw from very different angles. Would you be willing to hear that story? The judge asked, noting how the officer now met his gaze directly, without the suspicious glance that had marked their earlier interaction. It might help us both understand tonight a little better. The officer nodded, and in that simple gesture, the judge saw something powerful, the beginning of change. Not the dramatic kind that makes headlines, but the quiet, personal kind that truly transforms communities one interaction at a time. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the judge began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. A young man walked into my courtroom, shoulders slumped, looking like he already lost before the case even started. He was a teacher, stopped for a broken taillight that turned into something much bigger because of assumptions and fear on both sides. The officer listened intently, his notepad forgotten in his hand. The night air had grown cooler, but neither man seemed to notice. They stood in the glow of the street lamp, two people finding common ground in an unexpected moment. The teacher had been driving home from a late-night school event, a science fair he helped organize. He was tired, proud of his students' work, and thinking about the next day's lessons. Then he saw the lights in his mirror. The judge paused, watching recognition flicker across the officer's face. The stop went badly. Not because anyone did anything wrong, exactly, but because both sides brought their fears and past experiences with them. The officers saw a nervous man reaching for something. The teacher saw yet another stop where he had to prove he belonged in his own car, in his own neighborhood. The officer shifted his weight, perhaps remembering his own approach just minutes earlier. What happened? He asked, his voice softer than before. The teacher ended up in handcuffs because a textbook on his backseat was mistaken for something else in the dark. His students saw him like that the next day on social media. Some parents pulled their kids from his class. The judge's words hung in the air between them. But that's not why I'm telling you this story, the judge continued. I'm telling you because of what happened 6 months later. That same officer came back to my courtroom, not for a case, but to apologize. He'd spent months thinking about that night, about how different it could have been with just a few changed words, a different tone, a moment of understanding. A car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating both men's faces, one in a judge's suit, one in a police uniform, both nodding in quiet understanding. The officer and the teacher now work together, speaking at community meetings. They talk about fear, about assumptions, about how we can all do better. They turn their worst moment into something that helps others avoid the same mistakes. The judge straightened up, his hand resting on his car. You know what struck me most about that case? Both men were good at their jobs. Both wanted to make their community better. Both were trying to do the right thing. But that night, they couldn't see past their assumptions to recognize that in each other. The officer looked down at the judge's credentials still in his hand, then back at the perfectly working brake lights. I made assumptions tonight, he admitted, the words coming slowly but surely. We all do, the judge replied. The question is, what do we do after we realize we've made them? He gestured to the police station visible a few blocks away. That building and my courthouse, they're supposed to work together to help this community. But that only happens when we see each other as people first, titles second. The cool night air carried the distant sound of sirens, a reminder of the ongoing work of both law enforcement and the justice system. But right here, in this moment, something important was happening. A conversation that started with suspicion was transforming into one understanding. Would you be interested in hearing more about what that officer and teacher did? The judge asked. About how they turned their experience into something positive for our community. He saw genuine interest replace the earlier discomfort in the officer's expression. Back in his patrol car, the officer sat quietly, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The judge had driven away several minutes ago, but the weight of their conversation still hung in the air. The empty citation book lay unopened on the passenger seat, a reminder of how differently this evening had turned out from what he expected. He reached for his coffee, now cold and forgotten during their talk. Taking a sip, he remembered the judge's words about the teacher and the late-night science fair. How many times had he himself made quick judgments? How many traffic stops had started with one assumption and ended with another? Through his windshield, he watched the regular flow of night traffic. People heading home from late shifts, teenagers out for fast food runs, cab drivers making their rounds. Each car held a story he couldn't see from the outside. Each driver was someone's parent, child, or friend, just trying to get where they needed to go. The radio crackled with routine updates, but he didn't reach for it just yet. His mind wandered to his own family, how his dad had taught him to be careful around authority, even while encouraging him to become a police officer. It's not about the uniform, his father had said. It's about the person wearing it. He pulled out his phone and opened his photo gallery. There was a picture from last week's community outreach event. Him high-fiving kids at the local elementary school, teaching them about safety. He felt proud that day, certain he was making a difference. But tonight's encounter made him wonder. How many of those kids' parents tensed up when they saw his patrol car in their rearview mirror? The judge's story about the teacher and the officer who came back to apologize stuck with him. It took real courage to admit being wrong, to face up to mistakes and learn from them. He thought about his own training at the academy, all the procedures, protocols, and policies. But tonight's lesson wasn't in any manual. A car drove past, its brake lights glowing red, perfectly functional, just like the judge's had been. He felt a flush of embarrassment but pushed past it. The judge had offered understanding instead of anger, wisdom instead of accusation. That choice spoke volumes. He pulled out his notebook and started writing, not his usual incident report, but something different. He wrote about assumptions, about fear on both sides of the badge, about how quickly a routine stop could turn into a life-changing moment, for better or worse. The next call would come soon enough. Another traffic stop, another split-second decision, another chance to either build trust or break it. But something had shifted inside him. The judge's words echoed in his mind. We don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. Looking up, he noticed a father and son walking past his patrol car. The father pulled his son closer instinctively. A small gesture he might have missed before tonight. Instead of feeling defensive, he understood. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. He picked up his radio, but instead of calling and available for the next call, he made a different decision. Dispatch, I'd like to request information about our community engagement programs. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, slightly surprised at the unusual request. As he wrote down the details, he thought about the judge's invitation to learn more about the program started by that teacher and officer. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd make that call. Tonight had started as a routine patrol, but was ending as something much more significant, a first step toward real change. The night stretched ahead, full of possibilities he hadn't seen before. He started his car, ready to patrol again, but with new eyes and a deeper understanding of the power he held, not just in his badge and uniform, but in his ability to choose how he saw and treated every person he encountered. 2 weeks after that night, the courthouse meeting room buzzed with nervous energy. The judge stood at the front, watching as police officers and community members filled the seats. Some wore uniforms, others casual clothes, but everyone shared the same uncertain expressions. The officer from that night sat in the front row, his badge catching the fluorescent light. He'd been the first to sign up when the judge announced this new program, a series of honest conversations between law enforcement and the community they served. "Welcome," the judge began, his voice carrying the same calm authority it held that night on the street. "We're here because every one of us wants the same thing, a safer, more understanding community. But wanting isn't enough. We need to talk, and more importantly, we need to listen." He shared the story of their encounter, careful to protect the officer's dignity while being honest about what happened. The room grew quiet as he described how a routine traffic stop transformed into something meaningful. Heads nodded, both officers and civilians recognizing pieces of their own experiences. A young mother raised her hand, her voice shaking slightly as she described teaching her children what to do during traffic stops. An older officer spoke about his early days on the force, admitting how fear and misunderstanding had colored his judgment. The conversation began to flow, awkward at first, then with growing openness. The officer from that night stood up, surprising everyone. 2 weeks ago, I thought I knew everything about being a good cop, he said, looking around the room. But one traffic stop showed me how much I still had to learn. His honesty broke down more barriers, encouraging others to share their stories. The judge watched as people who might never have spoken to each other began to really talk. A teenager described feeling targeted for the clothes he wore. A veteran officer explained the weight of split-second decisions. A business owner talked about his mixed feelings, wanting security but fearing harassment. They set up role-playing scenarios. Officers sat in civilian cars, experiencing what it felt like to be pulled over. Community members put on training gear, learning about the challenges officers faced. Understanding began to grow, not in big dramatic moments, but in small nods of recognition, in questions asked with genuine curiosity. The judge introduced a mentorship program, pairing officers with community members for regular coffee meetings. The officer from that night was the first to volunteer, paired with a local high school counselor. Together, they would visit schools, sharing their perspectives and helping build trust early. As the meeting wound down, people lingered, exchanging contact information and making plans for future discussions. The judge overheard snippets of conversation. Officers planning to attend community events out of uniform, residents organizing ride-alongs to better understand police work. The officer approached the judge as the room cleared. "I never thought my mistake would lead to something like this," he said, gesturing at the positive energy in the room. "Thank you for not just getting angry that night." The judge smiled, remembering their conversation under the streetlight. "Change happens one conversation at a time," he replied. "We just had to create the space for those conversations to happen." They looked around the room, at the empty chairs where barriers had begun to fall, at the whiteboard filled with ideas and action plans, at the calendar already marked with future meeting dates. What had started as a tense traffic stop was growing into something that could change their whole community. As they walked out together, the officer turned to the judge. "You know, every traffic stop since that night has been different. I keep thinking about the stories I heard today. It's like I'm seeing people, not just situations. 6 months had passed since that first community meeting. The police station's briefing room looked different now. Walls covered with community event photos and thank you letters from local schools. But the biggest changes weren't visible on the walls. They were in the hearts and minds of the officers themselves. The officer who'd stopped the judge that night stood before his fellow officers during morning briefing. Once nervous about public speaking, he now commanded attention with quiet confidence. "Yesterday, I had a traffic stop that could have gone badly," he began, his voice carrying across the room. "But because of what we've learned, it ended with handshakes instead of handcuffs." Other officers leaned forward, many holding cups of morning coffee, all listening intently. These sharing sessions had become a regular part of their routine, replacing the old habit of swapping stories about difficult arrests with stories of positive community interactions. "The driver was angry at first," the officer continued. "But I remembered what we learned about slowing down, about explaining things clearly, about seeing the person behind the wheel as someone's family member." He paused, letting his words sink in. By the end, he was showing me pictures of his kid's science project. A rookie officer raised her hand. "But what about officer safety? We can't let our guard down completely." It was a common concern, one that had come up often in the early days of these changes. The officer nodded, understanding the question perfectly. "Being respectful doesn't mean being careless," he explained. "Actually, I've found that when I approach with respect, people are more likely to respect me back. My job feels safer now, not more dangerous." He pulled out a folder filled with statistics, numbers that told a powerful story. Complaints against officers had dropped significantly. Community cooperation in investigations had increased. Even routine traffic stops were producing more positive outcomes. "Remember last week's drug bust?" he asked. "That tip came from someone who attended one of our community meetings. They trusted us enough to share information because they'd seen how we changed." The briefing room buzzed with conversation as officers shared their own experiences. One talked about how he diffused a tense situation by using techniques learned in their new training. Another mentioned how local teenagers now waved at her patrol car instead of avoiding eye contact. The chief walked in, nodding approvingly at the discussion. Under their leadership, the department had embraced these changes, making them part of their official training program. New officers now learned about community engagement alongside traditional police work. Last month, 3 other departments sent representatives to learn about our program, the chief announced. "They want to know how we transformed our relationship with the community, and it all started with one traffic stop, one honest conversation." The officer thought back to that night, to his embarrassment when he realized his mistake with the judge. How that moment of discomfort had led to personal growth he never expected. Now he was helping other officers learn from his experience. After the briefing, he walked to his patrol car, greeting the morning shift custodian by name, something he wouldn't have done before. His phone buzzed with a message from the high school counselor he'd been paired with. They were scheduled to speak to students later that week about building trust between young people and law enforcement. As he started his patrol, he noticed things he might have missed before. The elderly man who needed help crossing the street, the kids practicing basketball in the park, the woman struggling with grocery bags. Each interaction was an opportunity to show how the department had changed. His radio crackled with a call, and he smiled, knowing that whatever situation he was about to face, he'd handle it differently than he would have 6 months ago. The badge on his chest felt lighter somehow, no longer a symbol of authority alone, but of responsibility and community service. The conference hall was packed with faces from across the country. Police chiefs, judges, community leaders, all gathered to learn about what one small city had accomplished. At the podium stood an unlikely pair, the judge in his formal suit and the officer in his dress uniform. "A year ago, I made a traffic stop that changed everything," the officer began, his voice steady despite the large crowd. "I thought I was just doing my job. Instead, I learned the most important lesson of my career." He glanced at the judge, who nodded encouragingly. The judge stepped forward, sharing his side of the story. He described the familiar knot in his stomach when he saw the flashing lights, the choice he made to turn a tense moment into a teaching opportunity. The audience leaned forward, recognizing pieces of their own community's struggles in this story. "But we're not here to talk about that night," the officer continued. "We're here to show you what happened next." He clicked to the first slide, showing their community meetings, the training sessions, the partnerships that had grown from that single encounter. A photo appeared on the screen. Officers and teenagers playing basketball together, both sides smiling genuinely. "This wasn't a photo op," the judge explained. "This was taken 6 months into our program. These kids now stop by the station just to talk. Some are interested in becoming officers themselves." The officer shared real numbers: complaints down by 60%, community tips up by 40%, improved response times because people were more willing to cooperate with police. But it was the personal stories that really caught everyone's attention. He told them about the elderly woman who'd always been scared to call the police, even when she needed help. Now she brought cookies to the station every Wednesday. About the local business owner who went from viewing officers with suspicion to helping organize community safety workshops. The judge described how his own courtroom had changed. "I'm seeing fewer cases of resisting arrest, fewer confrontations turned violent. When people trust the system, they're more likely to work within it." He paused, letting that sink in. "And when officers see people as neighbors rather than suspects, everyone benefits." Questions came from the audience. Practical concerns about budgets, training time, resistance to change. The officer and judge answered honestly, acknowledging the challenges while showing how the benefits far outweighed the costs. "Change isn't always comfortable," the officer admitted. "Some of our veteran officers were skeptical at first, but when they saw how much easier their jobs became when the community trusted them, they came around." A police chief from another state raised her hand. "This sounds great in theory, but how do you maintain it? How do you keep the momentum going?" The judge smiled. "By celebrating small victories, by sharing stories, by remembering that every interaction is a chance to build trust or break it." He clicked to the next slide, a graph showing steady improvement in community relations over the past year. The officer added, "We made it part of our daily routine. It's not just a program anymore, it's how we do our job." He described their morning briefings, how they now shared success stories alongside tactical updates. As the presentation ended, people didn't rush out. They gathered in small groups, sharing similar stories from their own cities, exchanging contact information, making plans to implement these ideas in their own communities. The officer and judge stood to the side, watching as their experience rippled outward. "Think he'll work in other places?" the officer asked quietly. "It already is," the judge replied, nodding toward the energized crowd. "Change starts with one person willing to see things differently. We just showed them it's possible." 2 years had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The judge sat in his chambers, reviewing a stack of letters from across the country. Each envelope told a similar story: how their program had inspired change in other communities, how relationships between police and citizens were slowly healing. A knock at his door interrupted his reading. The officer stood there, holding a local newspaper. The front page showed a photo of their latest community gathering: children, parents, and police officers working together to plant a community garden. "Remember when this all started?" the officer asked, settling into the chair across from the judge's desk. "One traffic stop, one conversation. Now look at this." He spread out several articles from different cities, each describing programs modeled after theirs. The judge picked up one of the stories. A small town in the Midwest had turned an abandoned building into a community center where officers taught youth programs. Another city had started monthly dinners where police and residents shared meals and stories. "Got something even better to show you," the officer said, pulling out his phone. He played a video of a recent traffic stop recorded by a civilian. Instead of tension and fear, the video showed respect on both sides. The officer in the video took time to explain the violation, listened to the driver's concerns, and ended the interaction with a handshake. "That was one of our new officers," he explained proudly. "She went through our updated training program. Never knew how things used to be." The judge noticed how naturally the new generation of officers adopted these approaches. For them, community policing wasn't a special program, it was just how the job was done. They walked together to the courthouse steps, where a small crowd had gathered for their weekly community forum. These meetings had become a town tradition, a place where people could voice concerns, share successes, and work together on solutions. A teenager stepped up to the microphone, telling how an officer had helped him start a youth basketball league instead of writing him up for playing in the street. An elderly woman shared how she no longer felt afraid when police cars drove through her neighborhood. The chief of police stood next, presenting their latest statistics. Crime rates had fallen, but more importantly, community participation had soared. People were looking out for each other, reporting problems before they grew serious, working with police instead of against them. But the numbers don't tell the whole story, the judge said, taking his turn at the microphone. The real change is in the everyday moments, the friendly waves, the casual conversations, the trust that's built one interaction at a time. He looked out at the faces before him. Officers and citizens, young and old, all part of this ongoing transformation. In the back, he spotted a familiar face, the officer who'd stopped him that night, now promoting community programs full-time. A young officer raised her hand. "My cousin's police department wants to start something similar. Any advice?" The original officer stepped forward. "Tell them to start small. One conversation, one changed mind at a time. Share the successes, learn from the setbacks, and remember that every interaction matters." As the sun set behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps, the judge reflected on how far they'd come. That tense traffic stop could have ended so differently, with anger, with accusations, with another story of division. Instead, it had sparked a movement that was slowly changing police departments across the country. "You know what the best part is?" the officer said quietly, watching the crowd disperse. "These kids growing up now, they'll never know it was any different. For them, this is just how things are supposed to be." The judge nodded, picking up a crayon drawing a child had given him. A picture of police officers and community members holding hands. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, he thought. One traffic stop, one choice to listen, one chance to make a difference.